Hello, my name is Marcus, and I'm your guide through one of the darkest chapters in human history. For the next hour, I'll be walking you through the authentic, visceral, and often heartbreaking accounts of soldiers who lived and died in the trenches of World War I, specifically during the year 1916, a year that would forever change warfare, society, and the very meaning of sacrifice. Before we begin this journey into the muddy, blood-soaked earth of the Western Front, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? Leave a comment below. Are you in a warm, comfortable home? Perhaps you're taking a break from work, or maybe you're lying in bed. Whatever your circumstances, I want you to understand something. The men whose stories we're about to tell would have given anything for a moment of comfort like yours. This is not just a history lesson. This is a window into the daily reality of approximately 60,000 British soldiers who were killed in a single day, July 1, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. This is a story about survival, brotherhood, death, and the human spirit's capacity to endure unimaginable horror. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe to explore more untold stories from history. And I encourage you, engage with this narrative. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me how this story makes you feel. Tell me what shocks you, what moves you, what disturbs you. Because these men deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be heard by people who care enough to listen. Now, let's descend into the trenches of 1916, where millions of men faced the machinery of modern warfare with nothing but rifles, determination, and the hope that somehow they would see their families again. The British Expeditionary Force stretched across the northern sector of the Western Front like a wounded serpent, coiled and waiting. It was 6 a.m. on July 1, 1916, and Private James Whitmore, age 22, stood in the trenches near the village of Beaumont Hamel, adjusting his puttees, the long strips of cloth wrapped around his lower legs, with trembling fingers. The dawn had arrived cold and gray. The sky above the Western Front was a study in bleakness. Low-hanging clouds the color of old ash hung over the landscape like a funeral shroud. There had been rain during the night, and the trench floor, a mixture of mud, blood, shell casings, and things that soldiers had learned not to identify, was even more treacherous than usual. The temperature hovered around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but the damp penetrated every layer of clothing, every cell of the human body, until a man felt as though he were slowly freezing from the inside out. James was not alone. Around him, thousands of soldiers, British, Irish, Scottish, and South African troops, stood at the firing steps or crouched in the communication trenches, waiting. Their uniforms were a motley collection of khaki wool, now stained with mud, blood, and the accumulated filth of weeks in the line. Their eyes, though, were what told the real story. They were the eyes of men who had begun to understand their mortality. To James's left stood his best friend, Thomas "Tommy" Hughes, a coal miner from South Wales. Tommy was shorter than James, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that had spent years hacking coal from the earth. He had joined the army 18 months ago, convinced, as so many young men had been, that the war would be over by Christmas, that Christmas had come and gone while he was in the trenches. This was now his second Christmas away from his wife, Margaret, and their young daughter, Eleanor. "Look at this lot," Tommy muttered, his Welsh accent thick with bitterness. He was gesturing at the artillery barrage that had been thundering for the past 7 days without cessation. The ground beneath their feet vibrated constantly, a low, stomach-churning throb that had become so familiar that the absence of it, the temporary silences that sometimes came, felt more disturbing than the explosions themselves. For 7 days, from June 24th through June 30th, the British artillery had pounded the German lines. According to the High Command, it was a bombardment that would crush all German fortifications and leave no enemy soldier alive to defend them. The officers spoke of it with absolute certainty. The barrage would be so devastating that the infantry advance, scheduled to begin at 7:30 a.m., would be nothing more than a walk across no man's land to occupy empty trenches. Every soldier who had been at the front long enough to understand the realities of warfare harbored doubts about this narrative. But the younger recruits, The fresh-faced boys who had arrived in France just weeks before clung to the officers' promises like drowning men to driftwood. James had been in France for 14 months. He was old enough to have learned that the promises of the High Command were often lies, sometimes well-intentioned lies meant to keep morale high, sometimes lies born from sheer ignorance of battlefield conditions. But he was young enough still to hope that this time perhaps the generals knew what they were doing. The trench itself was a study in engineered misery. It was roughly 6 feet deep with fire steps built into the front wall so that soldiers could stand and fire over the parapet. The walls were theoretically reinforced with sandbags, corrugated iron, and wooden frames, but the constant bombardment had torn great gaps in these defenses. Water pooled in sections of the trench, turning the floor into a soup of mud and putrefaction. The smell was unlike anything civilians could imagine, a combination of human waste, the latrines were overflowing, decomposing bodies, men killed in no man's land during the past weeks couldn't be retrieved, cordite from the artillery fire, and the sickly sweetness of infection. James pulled his gas mask from its canvas bag and checked it, as he had checked it 100 times already that morning. The rubber was cold against his fingers. The mask was a relatively new addition to a soldier's equipment. The Germans had first used poison gas in April of 1915, and the shock of that new horror had reverberated through the entire British Expeditionary Force. Now, every soldier carried the mask like a talisman against death. James had seen men gassed during his time in France. They were horrible deaths, men clawing at their own throats, their lungs filled with liquid, suffocating in the open air. Around him, officers moved up and down the trench, checking watches and making final adjustments to the attack plan. Captain Harold Sorley, a 45-year-old career officer who had served in the Boer War and spoke with the clipped, decisive tone of a man accustomed to obedience, was reviewing the order of attack with his platoon sergeants. 0 hour is 7:30 a.m., Sorley announced, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the trench. We will advance in waves, maintaining formation, and march across no man's land at a steady pace. The artillery has destroyed all the barbed wire and German positions. You will encounter minimal resistance. Minimal resistance. The word sounded obscene to James's ears. He had learned, through 14 months of warfare, that the Germans were formidable opponents. They were disciplined, well supplied, and they had spent the past 2 years entrenching themselves in positions all along the Western Front. The idea that a 1-week bombardment would simply erase them, that it would leave no man's land empty and ready for occupation, seemed fantastical. But who was he to question the officers? James Whitmore was a private soldier, one of nearly 2 million British troops who would eventually serve in World War I. He had been a carpenter's apprentice before the war, a young man with skills and plans for a peaceful future. That future now seemed impossibly distant, like something from a dream he could barely remember. At 6:45 a.m., an unusual order came down the line. The soldiers were to stand down, step back from the firing steps, and wait. The German artillery, which had been relatively quiet compared to the massive British bombardment, suddenly began to intensify. Shells exploded along the British trenches, and men crouched low, pressing themselves against the trench walls, seeking what little shelter the earthwork could provide. "Gas!" someone screamed, and the word rippled through the trench like an electric current. "Gas! Gas!" Soldiers fumbled with their masks, pulling them on with fingers that were no longer quite steady. James got his mask on, felt the rubber seal against his face, and forced himself to breathe through the filter. The world became slightly distorted, viewed through the eyepieces of the mask, the sounds of the world muffled by the rubber and fabric. All around him, soldiers in gas masks looked like something from a nightmare, faceless, identical, dehumanized. But the gas alert passed. Either it was a false alarm, or the wind had blown the gas toward the German lines. Slowly, carefully, soldiers removed their masks and took deep breaths of the poisoned air. At 7 a.m., the British artillery bombardment, which had been continuing at a steady rate, suddenly intensified to a crescendo. The ground shook violently. Men gripped the trench walls to keep from falling. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the barrage stopped. The silence was almost more shocking than the explosions. 7:25 a.m. Officers checked their watches. Whistles were prepared, held ready in trembling hands. James looked at Tommy, and Tommy looked back at him. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of what was about to happen, a farewell that neither of them wanted to speak aloud. 7:30 a.m. The whistles blew, a sound that would echo through the trenches of the Western Front and through the nightmares of survivors for the rest of their lives. "Over the top! Come on, lads! Over the top!" officers shouted, pointing toward the parapet, and James Whitmore, along with thousands of other men, climbed the fire steps, pulled himself up and over the parapet of the trench, and stepped out into no man's land. What he saw would have seemed impossible if it were not happening before his very eyes. The German barbed wire was still standing. 7 days of bombardment, and the barbed wire still stood in front of the German trenches, a tangled maze of metal designed to catch men like flies in a web. And in the German trenches, figures were moving, soldiers, still alive, thousands of them. The bombardment had not killed them. It had not destroyed their fortifications. It had, in fact, done something far worse. It had allowed them time to prepare, to reinforce their positions, to set up machine guns. James was walking across no man's land, a distance of roughly 300 yards of muddy, shell-cratered ground. Ahead of him were thousands of other British soldiers, all maintaining formation, all walking at a steady pace toward the German lines. They were holding their rifles at the ready, but they were not running. They were walking, exactly as the officers had instructed them to do. The German machine guns opened fire. The sound was like nothing James had heard before, a mechanical ripping, a sound that seemed to come from hell itself. Around him, soldiers began to fall. They fell in groups, cut down by streams of bullets, as though God himself had drawn a line across no man's land and decreed that all those who crossed that line must die. "Keep going! Keep moving!" the officers shouted, but there was no keeping going through this. There was no moving forward into that wall of lead. James found himself walking past men he had shared trenches with for months, men who were now lying in the mud with blood pouring from their wounds, men who were screaming for help, men who were already dead. His fear was beyond anything he had experienced. It was a primal thing, a force that wanted to turn him around and send him running back to the trench. But the officers were behind him, and to turn back was to face court-martial and execution. So he kept walking forward, into the hail of bullets, into the machinery of death that the Germans had prepared. A shell exploded to his left, and he felt the concussion, felt the heat, felt something warm spray across his face. He didn't look to see what had happened. He couldn't. He just kept moving. Tommy was ahead of him, his shorter frame making him less visible among the taller soldiers. James tried to keep Tommy in sight, using his friend as an anchor to reality in a situation that had become fundamentally insane. They were perhaps 200 yards from the German trenches when James understood that they were not going to reach them. The machine gun fire was simply too intense. The German bombardment, which had resumed in earnest, was tearing gaps in the advancing formation that could never be filled because there were no more men to fill them. They were falling too fast, dying too quickly. The order came to halt and take what shelter they could in the shell craters. Men dove toward the holes in the ground, pressing themselves into whatever protection they could find. James found himself in a crater with perhaps 30 other soldiers. The crater was perhaps 8 feet deep and about 20 feet across, and it was crowded with frightened, bleeding men. Tommy was not with him. James looked around, trying to spot his friend, but the confusion and chaos made it impossible to see clearly. Other soldiers were crying out, calling for help, calling for their mothers, calling for mercy. A young soldier next to James, he couldn't have been more than 18 years old, was holding his stomach and making a sound that was almost a whimper. "Where's my blood?" the young man asked almost conversationally. "I can feel it, but I can't see it. It's all inside." "Is it all inside?" James didn't know how to answer. He had never received medical training. He was a carpenter's apprentice turned soldier, and he was completely unprepared for the reality of industrial-scale warfare. The machine gun fire continued, sweeping across no man's land, hitting targets that were either standing or crouching or lying in shell craters. It was indiscriminate, relentless, and utterly devastating. James realized with a clarity that felt almost dreamlike that he was going to die. Today, in this shell crater, on this field in northern France, his life was going to end. The sun was beginning to angle toward the western horizon when a new sound reached him. Voices. German voices, calling out from the trenches ahead. They were calling for the wounded, urging the British soldiers to come to them. They would get medical attention, the voices promised. They would be treated as prisoners of war, protected by the Geneva Convention. James didn't believe them. But some soldiers did. Over the next hour, he watched as perhaps a dozen men, driven by thirst and fear and pain beyond endurance, got to their feet and began walking toward the German lines. Some of them made it. Others were shot down by their own side, by British officers who considered any man attempting to surrender to be a coward whose defection might lower morale among the remaining troops. War, James was discovering, had rules of its own, brutal, arbitrary, and utterly indifferent to individual human suffering. As darkness began to fall, slowly, given that it was summer in northern France and the sun didn't set until nearly 10 p.m., the machine gun fire finally ceased. The Germans, satisfied that they had killed or disabled most of the British soldiers in no man's land, seemed content to let nature finish the job. The night was the worst part. With darkness came the sounds of dying men calling out in the darkness. Somewhere to James's left, a soldier was screaming, not coherent words, just screams, raw sounds of agony that seemed to go on and on without end. Somewhere to his right, another man was weeping, begging for someone to shoot him, to put him out of his misery. James tried to block out the sounds, but it was impossible. The crater had become a small island of consciousness in an ocean of suffering, and the sounds of that suffering seemed to press in from all sides. At some point during the night, he had lost all sense of time. Soldiers from the British trenches began attempting rescues. Small teams of volunteers would leave the relative safety of the trenches and crawl out into no man's land, trying to reach wounded men and drag them back to the lines. It was dangerous, suicidal work. German snipers, alerted by the sound of movement, would begin firing, and many of the would-be rescuers would be hit before they could even reach the wounded they were trying to save. One of these rescue teams nearly found James. A corporal with a stretcher crawling on his belly nearly reached the crater. James, who had been silent and nearly motionless for hours, suddenly found himself wanting to call out, to attract the corporal's attention. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the realization that the corporal would likely be shot if he approached the crater. Perhaps it was a kind of resignation that had been building throughout the day. Either way, James remained silent, and the corporal, unable to locate him in the darkness, eventually withdrew. The night seemed to last forever. James drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure whether he was awake or dreaming, unsure whether the sounds he was hearing were real or hallucinatory. He found himself thinking about the life he had left behind. His mother in London, his sweetheart Catherine, they had been engaged just before he left for France, his apprenticeship, and the plans he'd had for becoming a master carpenter. Would Catherine ever know what had happened to him? Would his mother spend the rest of her life wondering whether he had died quickly or slowly, with suffering or without? These thoughts seemed more real than the shell crater itself, more immediate than his thirst or his fear. Toward dawn, as the sky began to lighten from black to deep gray to pale blue, the sounds of dying men began to diminish. Not because rescue had arrived, but because there were fewer men still conscious, still capable of calling out. The night had claimed many of them, either through wound infections, blood loss, or the simple failure of human bodies pushed beyond their endurance. James, against all odds and probability, was still alive. Hanging on to consciousness, July 2nd, 1916. The dawn came in shades of gray and pink, beautiful in a way that seemed almost obscene given the landscape it illuminated. No man's land, which had been largely invisible during the night, was now revealed in all its terrible reality. The bodies were everywhere. James, looking out from his shell crater, could see perhaps 200 corpses from his vantage point, and he knew that many more lay just out of sight, scattered across the field. Some were lying naturally, as though they had simply lain down to sleep. Others were twisted in unnatural positions, their final moments frozen in contorted shapes. Many were stripped naked, German soldiers had apparently come out during the night to loot the dead for valuables and weapons. The irony was that he could see the British trenches. They were behind him, only about 300 yards away, but they might as well have been on the other side of the world. There was no way to reach them. The open ground offered no cover, and attempting to cross it meant being cut down by the German guns. So James Whitmore sat in a shell crater in no man's land on July 1st, 1916, and waited for death to come. Around him, thousands of other men did the same. By the end of that day, when the attack was finally called off and the survivors were allowed to withdraw, 60,000 British soldiers would be counted as casualties, killed, wounded, or missing in action. It was the single worst day in British military history, and it marked the beginning of a months-long offensive that would ultimately claim over 1 million casualties on both sides for a territorial gain of only a few miles. But in that moment, in that shell crater, James Whitmore didn't know any of that. He only knew fear, confusion, and the certainty that his life was ending, far from home, far from those he loved, in a war that he was beginning to understand was not a noble adventure, but a machinery of death designed to consume the young men of Europe like fuel. The long night of July 1st. As the sun climbed higher in the sky on that terrible first day of July, the temperature began to rise. James remained in the shell crater, pinned down by the relentless machine gun fire. The German gunners seemed content to simply wait, conserving ammunition by only firing when movement was detected. It was a calculated strategy. Let the wounded bleed, let the dying soldiers suffer, and discourage any attempts at rescue. Around James, the young soldier who had asked about his blood, was dying. His name was Robert, or at least that's what someone had called him sometime in that first hour. Robert was from Manchester, and he kept repeating his address over and over, as though if he could just say it enough times, he would somehow be transported back there, back to the terraced house where his mother was waiting for him. 22 Marlborough Street, Manchester. 22 Marlborough Street, Manchester, Robert whispered, his voice growing weaker with each repetition. Tell her I love her. Tell her I wasn't afraid. Tell her... He didn't finish. His eyes, which had been fixed on some distant point in the sky, simply went blank. One moment he was a person, a conscious, living human being, and the next moment he was simply a body, cooling in the summer heat. James didn't try to help him. There was nothing to help with. He had already lost too much blood, and there were no medical supplies in the crater, no way to treat the wounds that had opened up his abdomen and allowed his life to drain away into the mud. The other soldiers in the crater responded to Robert's death with a kind of numb acceptance that was, in its own way, more disturbing than panic would have been. War, James was learning, had a way of breaking human emotions until nothing remained but a kind of hollow functionality. You kept breathing. You kept your head down. You tried not to think about the men lying dead in no man's land. Because if you started thinking about them, if you started imagining what they had experienced in their final moments, you would go mad. At around 2 p.m., there was a lull in the machine gun fire. It might have been that the German gunners needed to change ammunition belts. It might have been that they were taking a break. Whatever the reason, for perhaps 20 seconds, the fire slackened. That was enough. A few soldiers, understanding that they might not get another chance, scrambled out of the crater and began running toward the British trenches. James saw one of them make it perhaps 30 feet before he was cut down. Another managed to reach the trench line before being hit. Whether he was killed or simply wounded, James couldn't tell. The distance and the confusion made it impossible to know. When the machine gun fire resumed, James didn't attempt to run. His legs felt like they might not support him. His mind felt disconnected from his body, as though he were observing this situation from somewhere above, watching some other poor bastard sit in a crater and wait to die. Thirst became his dominant concern. His mouth was desert dry. His lips felt as though they might crack open. He could see water. Several shell craters nearby contained water from the recent rain, but some of those craters also contained bodies, and he'd heard enough soldier stories to know that water near corpses in summer heat was likely to carry disease. He settled for licking moisture off a piece of cloth he found in his jacket pocket. It provided almost no relief, but the act of doing something, anything, provided a psychological boost that was more valuable than the actual hydration.
A few were still alive. James could see movement in some areas. Wounded men calling out weakly, attempting to crawl toward the British trenches. Whether they would make it, he didn't know. By noon on July 2nd, the heat was becoming a serious problem. The temperature was climbing towards 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which in modern terms doesn't sound dangerous, but the combination of heat, dehydration, and wounds was becoming a killer in its own right. Several of the men still alive in the crater with James had stopped moving, their consciousness fading into a kind of fevered dream that would probably end in death. An older soldier, perhaps 40 years old, with gray in his beard, was trying to maintain some order among the remaining survivors. His name was Sergeant William Patterson, and he had the weathered, calm demeanor of a professional soldier. Before the war, he had served in India, and he had the kind of experience that came from seeing combat in various parts of the British Empire. "We need to maintain discipline," Patterson was saying, though James couldn't quite understand why discipline mattered at this point. "When darkness comes again, there will be another chance for rescue. We need to be ready to move when the opportunity presents itself." Ready to move. James looked at his legs, which seemed to belong to someone else. The muscles felt weak, disconnected. His right foot had gone numb at some point during the night, and he couldn't feel his toes. He wondered if gangrene was setting in. Gangrene was one of the great terrors of trench warfare. Soldiers had seen men lose entire limbs to the infection, had seen men die from it even after amputation. But there was no point in thinking about gangrene. If he had it, he had it, and there was nothing he could do about it from a shell crater in no man's land. Water remained an obsession. James had tried to ignore his thirst, to push it away as he pushed away other distractions, but it was becoming harder to ignore. His tongue felt like leather. His lips, when he ran his teeth across them, seemed to crack easily. Trying to swallow had become painful. Sometime in the early afternoon, a German soldier appeared on the parapet of the German trench. He was looking out over no man's land, surveying the landscape of death and suffering that his machine guns had created. The soldier was perhaps 20 years old, with a round face and light-colored hair. He didn't seem to be looking for any particular person, just surveying the scene in a kind of detached way. One of the other soldiers in the crater, a man who had been silent until that moment, suddenly sat up and raised his rifle. His hands were shaking, and his movements were slow and clumsy. "Don't," Sergeant Patterson said quietly. "You'll give away our position." "I don't care," the soldier muttered. His voice was hoarse, barely intelligible. "Let him shoot me. It would be better than this." The soldier pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the German soldier on the parapet disappeared. Whether he had been hit or simply ducked, James couldn't tell, but the effect was immediate. German fire began sweeping across no man's land again, apparently from different positions and with different weapons than the day before. The machine guns opened up, and the crater began receiving fire from multiple angles. "Down!" Patterson shouted, and the soldiers who could move pressed themselves into whatever cover the crater afforded. The German fire intensified for perhaps 2 minutes, then gradually tapered off. It seemed that the Germans, having been alerted to the presence of soldiers in no man's land, were simply making sure that none of them were going anywhere. The soldier who had fired the shot was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. Patterson tried to tend to it, using scraps of cloth to try to stanch the blood flow, but it was becoming clear that serious medical care was needed. "I'm sorry," the soldier kept saying. "I'm sorry. I just wanted it to be over." Trapped between two worlds, days 3 through 5 of the ordeal in no man's land were characterized by an increasing sense of unreality. James's mind, desperate for some way to process the horror of a situation, had begun to fragment. He would find himself having conversations with people who weren't there, his mother, Catherine, Tommy. He would lose track of how many days he had been in the crater. He became unable to distinguish between memories of his life before the war and hallucinations brought on by dehydration and psychological trauma. On what he thought was the 4th day, a Royal Artillery officer named Captain Edmund Blunden, a young officer with a haunted expression, managed to crawl into the crater. He had apparently been directing artillery fire from an observation post and had made a desperate dash toward the crater when he realized there were still men alive in no man's land. "How many?" Blunden asked, his voice urgent. How many of you are still conscious? Sergeant Patterson did a head count of the perhaps 30 men who had sheltered in the crater originally. Only 12 were still alive. Of those 12, only 7 were fully conscious. "We need to get them back," Blunden said, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer to what he was about to ask. "Is there any possibility of holding the position and being relieved?" Patterson shook his head. "The Germans own this ground. We have no support, no supplies, no reinforcements coming. We're on borrowed time, sir." Blunden was quiet for a moment, and James could see the weight of command pressing down on the officer's shoulders. Blunden couldn't be more than 25 years old, but he looked 50. The war had a way of aging people by decades in a matter of months. "Then we'll have to try for withdrawal," Blunden said finally. "At dusk, I'll lead whoever can move back toward the British lines. It'll be dangerous. We'll likely lose people." "We'll lose more if we stay," Patterson replied. The plan was set. As darkness began to fall, earlier than it had the previous nights, because the exhaustion of the situation was making the days seem longer than they actually were, the soldiers who could move began to prepare themselves. James, who had been lying still for so long that he wasn't entirely sure his legs would function, tried to stand. He managed to get to a crouching position before his right leg gave way beneath him. Patterson helped him up, supporting most of his weight. "Can you make it?" Patterson asked. "I'll have to," James replied. The words came out cracked and barely intelligible, his voice damaged by days of dehydration and disuse. As full darkness fell, a darkness so complete that James could barely see his own hands, Captain Blunden led the small group of survivors out of the crater. They moved slowly, crawling most of the time, dragging the men who couldn't walk under their own power. The journey of perhaps 300 yards took more than an hour. German flares suddenly lit up the sky, illuminating no man's land in a harsh, unnatural light. For a moment, the small group of survivors was fully exposed, and James was certain they were about to be cut down. But no firing came. Either the German gunners didn't see them, or they had grown tired of shooting at what was left of the British attack. The British trench appeared suddenly out of the darkness, materializing like something from a dream. Hands reached up from the fire step, pulling the survivors down into the blessed, relative safety of their own lines. James collapsed into the trench, not even bothering to get his feet all the way over the parapet, before collapsing completely. He had made it, against all probability and odds. He had survived. The price of survival. The British trenches were themselves scenes of chaos. The medical stations were overwhelmed. Hundreds of wounded men crowded into the aid posts, waiting for attention from a handful of medical orderlies and doctors. The tents where the most serious cases were kept were arranged in neat rows, but the reality inside them was anything but neat. Men were dying of infections, of blood loss, of shock, despite the best efforts of the medical personnel. James was triaged by a harried-looking doctor who spent perhaps 30 seconds examining him before moving on to the next patient. Dehydration, possible trench foot, psychological trauma, the doctor muttered, making notes on James's casualty card. Assign him to rear area. Next. For James, assignment to the rear area was a death sentence of a different kind, not physical, but psychological. It meant that his war, at least for now, was over. It meant that he was being removed from the line, sent away from the constant, low-level terror that had become normal. And it meant that he was abandoning Tommy, whose fate still remained unknown. The next morning, James was loaded onto a truck along with dozens of other wounded men. The truck driver, a cheerful Londoner named Mr. Finch, kept up a running commentary on the scenery as they drove away from the front toward the rear echelon areas. "You're lucky," Finch said, glancing back at James. "The lads at the front are catching it rough. Word is that General Rawlinson is planning to send in fresh troops to try and exploit any breakthrough. Any breakthrough." James wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but he didn't have the energy. The breakthrough hadn't materialized. The attack on July 1st had been a complete failure, and there had been no breakthrough to exploit. Instead, there were now mountains of bodies in no man's land, and plans were being made to do it all again. The rear area was like stepping into a different world. There were cots with clean sheets. There was warm food, not gourmet, but food that hadn't been sitting in the mud for days. There was relative silence, broken only by the distant sound of artillery, rather than the immediate roar of machine gun fire. The hospital was a converted schoolhouse in a French village about 20 miles from the front. The local French villagers, who had come to accept the presence of the British Army in their region, occasionally brought fresh produce and items they thought might help the wounded soldiers. James spent his first week in the hospital in a kind of daze. He slept for long stretches, a sleep that seemed to pull him down into darkness, and he would wake up unsure of how much time had passed. Nurses, both British and French, came and went, checking his wounds, administering what medical care they could. His feet were a concern. The trench foot that the doctor had suspected was in early stages. The skin was white and waterlogged, the tissue underneath beginning to show signs of damage. The doctors debated whether amputation would be necessary. James felt oddly detached from the discussions. It seemed like his feet belonged to someone else. It was during his second week in the hospital that a man was brought in who changed everything. The man was Tommy Hughes. Tommy's right arm had been hit by machine gun fire, and the wound had become infected. Gangrene had set in, and the doctors had already amputated the arm above the elbow. He was still recovering from the operation, still in pain, still processing the reality that he would never work as a miner again, never hold his daughter with two hands, never be the same person he had been. When Tommy saw James, the two men wept. It was a reaction that neither of them could control. Years of training to be stoic, to accept suffering without complaint, broke down in the face of finding someone from their shared hell who had survived. "You made it," Tommy said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank God, you made it." "So did you," James replied. "Though..." He gestured toward Tommy's amputated arm, but Tommy waved the question away. "I'm alive," he said simply. "I'm going home. I'll see Margaret and Eleanor again. That's all that matters." For the first time since crawling out of that shell crater, James felt a kind of peace settle over him. It wasn't the peace of happiness. It wasn't the peace of safety or security. It was simply the peace of having survived, of having made it through something that had seemed impossible, of having found someone else who understood. Why the battle continued. While James and Tommy recovered in the hospital, the Battle of the Somme continued, and continued, and continued. This is a part of the story that viewers often find most disturbing. The battle didn't end after July 1st. The initial catastrophic failure on the first day should have ended the offensive, should have prompted a cessation of operations and a reassessment of strategy. But it didn't. General Douglas Haig, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, and General Henry Rawlinson, the commander of the Fourth Army, decided to continue the offensive. Why? The reasons are complex and multifaceted, rooted in the strategic thinking of the time and the political pressures that military commanders faced. First, there was the matter of the French. The French army, under General Joseph Joffre, was engaged in a massive struggle with the Germans at Verdun, a battle that was consuming men and resources at an equally staggering rate. The British offensive on the Somme had been designed, in part, to relieve pressure on the French by forcing the Germans to divert resources northward. To stop the offensive after just one day would mean abandoning the French to fight alone. Second, there was the military doctrine of the time. The High Command believed that if they could simply maintain pressure on the German lines, if they could continue attacking wave after wave, eventually the German army would break. They would have no more reserves to throw into the line, and the British would achieve the breakthrough that modern warfare seemed to promise. A breakthrough that would lead to open maneuver and the defeat of the German army. Third, there was political pressure. The British public, while shocked by casualty figures, had been prepared for years of warfare. The war had been going on for nearly 2 years, and there was a sense that it would continue for years more. The commanders believed that the public would support a prolonged campaign if it seemed to be making progress. And fourth, perhaps most troublingly, there was a belief among the High Command that they had no better alternatives. The tactics of static trench warfare seemed to offer no other way forward. The enemy could not be outflanked or maneuvered because of the continuous line of trenches stretching from the Channel to Switzerland. The only option seemed to be to continue attacking until one side or the other simply ran out of men. So the battle continued. Throughout July, August, September, and into October, British troops, along with Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African forces, continued to attack German positions. Some days saw gains of a few hundred yards. Other days saw devastating casualties with virtually no territorial gain. The casualty figures were staggering. By August, British casualties had reached 200,000. By September, 400,000. The German army was also suffering enormous casualties. They were defending prepared positions, which gave them advantages that the attackers didn't have. But the sheer volume of casualties was still devastating. Officers who had previously believed in the doctrine of the high command began to question it. Some were killed before they could voice their doubts. Others were quietly transferred. A few, like Captain Edmund Blunden, who would later become a noted poet and writer, survived to record their experiences and question the strategy that had cost so many lives. The question that haunted everyone was, for what? A few miles of territory gained at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. Was it worth it? Would those few miles of territory contribute to winning the war? Or was this simply industrial-scale slaughter for no meaningful purpose? The long road back. By the time the Battle of the Somme officially ended in November 1916, James had been in the hospital for over 4 months. His feet, while not fully healed, had recovered enough that he could walk short distances without pain. The doctors had decided that amputation wouldn't be necessary, though he would likely always have reduced feeling in his toes and periodic pain in the affected areas. Psychologically, the recovery was more complicated. James had begun to experience what the doctors called shell shock, a condition that modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He experienced nightmares in which he was back in the shell crater, unable to move, trapped in no man's land forever. He had panic attacks when exposed to loud noises that resembled artillery fire. He found it difficult to sleep, difficult to concentrate, difficult to engage with other people. But the human mind has a remarkable capacity for adaptation. Over the months of his recovery, James began to adjust to his new reality. He accepted that he had been changed by what he had experienced, that he would never be quite the same person he had been before the war. But he also began to understand that he had survived for a reason, that he had been given a second chance at life, and that he needed to honor that by living as fully as he could. Tommy, meanwhile, was being prepared for repatriation to Britain. His amputation had healed well, and the doctors believed that with prosthetic fitting and rehabilitation, he would be able to have a reasonably functional life. He would likely never work as a miner again, but there were other options, other ways to be useful. The night before Tommy was to leave, the two men sat together in the hospital garden, a small plot of land that the hospital staff had cleared and planted with flowers and vegetables. It was one of the few places in the hospital where the sounds and sights of the war felt distant. "I'll be seeing Margaret soon," Tommy said. "I don't know how she'll react to me being like this. One arm. I'm not much of a husband like this." "You're alive," James said. "That's what matters. Margaret knows that. Eleanor will know that." "Will they?" Tommy asked. "I wonder sometimes if anyone who wasn't there can understand what the war is really like. How do I tell Margaret about the things I've seen? How do I make her understand the screaming, the blood, He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the horror he was remembering. "You don't," James said. "You can't. Some things can't be explained. You just try to move forward and hope that the people who love you will love you through it." Tommy nodded slowly. "What will you do? When you get back to England?" "I don't know," James admitted. "They're saying that once I recover enough, I'll probably be reassigned to front. Officers of my experience are valuable, apparently." The word officers was technically inaccurate. James was still a private soldier, not an officer. But he had been noticed by Captain Blunden, who had recommended him for possible officer training if he recovered. The possibility of becoming an officer offered a kind of status, a way to feel that his suffering had purpose and meaning. "I hope you don't have to go back," Tommy said. "I really do. But if you do..." "If I do, I'll think of you on the way to becoming a grandfather," James said, trying to bring some lightness to the conversation. "I'll think of you safely in Britain, and that will be enough." The next morning, Tommy was loaded onto an ambulance that would take him to a port for transport back to Britain. James watched as his best friend was driven away, and he felt a kind of profound loneliness settle over him. What the war meant, what it cost. By the time this narrative concludes, in January 1917, after James had been returned to active service and was awaiting reassignment. The full scope of what had happened on the Somme was becoming clear. The Battle of the Somme, which was supposed to be a breakthrough that would end the war, had instead become simply another chapter in a war of attrition that would ultimately consume millions. Official casualty figures reported nearly 1.2 million total casualties across all sides during the 141 days of the battle. The British had suffered approximately 420,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, with perhaps 125,000 killed. The French suffered approximately 195,000 casualties. The Germans, defending fixed positions, suffered fewer casualties, approximately 260,000. But these losses were devastating for an army that was already stretched thin across the entire Western Front. For territorial gain, the British advance was measured in miles, perhaps 6 miles at the deepest point of penetration. In modern military terms, this would be considered a failure. An advance of 6 miles in exchange for 420,000 casualties represent a cost of roughly 70,000 casualties per mile of territory gained. By any reasonable calculation, it was not a worthwhile trade. But the commanders of the time had different calculations. They reasoned that the German army was being worn down, that the continuous pressure would eventually break the German line, and that the war would be won not through brilliant maneuver, but through the grinding attrition of resources and men. In some sense, they were right. Germany would eventually be defeated, though it would take another 2 years of fighting, and ultimately a revolution within Germany itself to end the war. And the doctrine of attrition would cost Europe dearly. By the end of the war in 1918, approximately 17 million people would be dead, far more than at the start, and a generation of young men would be lost. For James Whitmore, the war continued. He would survive the war, though he would be wounded again in 1917 at the Battle of Passchendaele. He would return to Britain in 1918, broken in body and mind, to find that the world he had known before the war no longer existed. Tommy Hughes would make a home, and he would indeed become a grandfather, though he would always carry the psychological scars of the war alongside the physical loss of his arm. His marriage to Margaret would survive, though not without difficulty, and Eleanor would grow up knowing a father who had paid a terrible price for the freedom she would enjoy. Thousands of others would not be so fortunate. Thousands would die in no man's land, their bodies left unbared for days or weeks. Thousands would return home to find that the trauma they had experienced was something that neither they nor their families knew how to process. Many would struggle with what we now call PTSD for the rest of their lives. And the world, which had sent millions of young men off to war with promises of glory and quick victory, would be forced to reckon with the reality of what industrial-scale warfare actually meant. As we conclude this journey into the trenches of 1916, I want to ask you something important. So far in this video, you've been following along, absorbing the stories of James Whitmore, Tommy Hughes, and the thousands of other men whose lives and deaths defined the Battle of the Somme. But I want to know, what are your thoughts? The comment section below is open, and I would genuinely like to hear from you. Tell me, did this story change how you think about World War I? Which moment in James's experience most affected you? Do you have ancestors who fought in World War I? If so, tell me their story. Thousands of soldiers' experiences have been preserved in family records, letters, and oral histories. Your family's story might be one of them. This is not just history. This is a story of human suffering, human courage, and human survival in conditions that most of us can barely imagine. These men deserve to be remembered. And the only way they can truly be remembered is if their stories continue to be told and retold, if each generation hears about the price that was paid. If this video has moved you, please subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories to tell. Stories of courage and sacrifice. Stories of human resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. Each story deserves to be heard, and each story deserves an audience that cares enough to listen. Also, please share this video with anyone you think might be interested. History is not just something that happened in the past. It is something that shapes who we are and who we will become. The lessons of 1916 about the horrors of war, about the cost of pride and miscalculation in military planning, about the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. These lessons are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Thank you for joining me in the trenches of 1916. Thank you for bearing witness to the stories of men like James Whitmore, who survived something that seemed unsurvivable. And thank you for caring enough about history to listen to these voices from the past, voices that deserve to be heard and remembered. This was Life in the Trenches in 1916. This was Daily Horror in World War I. And this is a story that, if we let it, has the power to teach us something fundamental about the human condition and the price of war. Where are you watching from? In that comfortable place, warm and safe. How does this story make you feel? Let me know in the comments below. I'm reading every response, and your thoughts matter. Your engagement with this history is what keeps these stories alive. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next narrative.